Hey guys, welcome to another Lifestyle of Eden podcast. I am your host, as always, Nick Tognetti. Today I have a very special guest and dear friend coming out of Chi-Town, Chicago, Illinois, Brandi Bradley. Brandi, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
And what's the name of your business, Brandi, so everybody can know?
So it's better with Coach B, but my specific hormone program is Hormone Revive and Thrive.
Yeah, Better with Coach B. That's what I'm always saying. That's your Instagram as well, which all of Brandy's notes are all of her links and how to get in contact with her are down below so that you can reach out to her, so that you can get connected with her and everything else. But today I want to talk about a topic that is very rampant today, which is Hashimoto's. It's an autoimmune disease of the thyroid, generally speaking, hypothyroid. But as we'll probably end up going, because I really specialize with autoimmune diseases. That's what a lot of the coaches come to me for, the MD in my practice, the nurse practitioners, everything else. And so what we talk about today is generally going to be able to be applied to almost every autoimmune disease because technically they're all really the same thing, but they're just manifesting through different manifestations or symptomatologies. But the reality is the body in and of itself is doing the same thing. The immune system is doing the same thing, and the tissues are having the same victim-like response. With you, Brandi, you've obviously had Hashimoto's or do have or whatever, and that's what I want to get into and dial deep into. Before we get into that, how did you get into this coaching space, functional coaching? How'd you get into this fitness spot? Give me like a synopsis of what that really looked like over the past several years.
Yeah, so there's a lot of different pieces to that puzzle that kind of trickled into diagnosing of Hashimoto's. So I got pregnant with my first baby, and that process was pretty stressful. I wasn't in the fitness industry at that time, so this was about 6 years ago. And so when I went through that pregnancy, I was a single mom. I was working two jobs, and so I was very stressed. And then she was a very difficult baby, crying all the time, very much significant lack of sleep. So going through all of that, there was just a lot of stress on my body, right? And so it was a year of stress. And then we'll get into the birth control thing. I got on birth control 6 weeks postpartum and eventually ended up switching birth controls. And when I switched birth controls, everything just went to shit with my health. And not only was that a piece to it, but it was also a piece of bodybuilding. So I didn't go on stage, I didn't prep for stage or anything like that, but I prepped for lifestyle. And I truly believe that I didn't have the right coach because that coach basically just pulled my calories down to significant amounts. And I was in a deficit for over 6 months.
Which
And
added more to the stress you already had with your baby and everything else. Yeah.
exactly. So you can see where it's like stress, and none of it was ever dealt with.
Right.
And so then with bodybuilding and eating 1,300 calories is what she ended me on. It was
Yeah. Oh
and
God.
it was just like straight deficit that whole time. So it was just lower and lower calories. And so I could tell that my body was like hitting a wall, and I was like, I'm done. Mentally, I'm done. Physically, I'm done. And
Yeah.
I just kept doing what my coach was telling me to do. And so when I switched birth controls, like post that last bit of my deficit,
Sure.
everything just crashed. I was so depressed. I was so anxious. I literally felt like I drank a bottle of tequila every single night and woke up with the worst hangover of my life.
That's
That's
crazy.
how horrible I felt as far as like the brain fog, the inability to get out of bed in the morning. Those two are probably the worst. And I would say that, I had most would call it postpartum rage, but I was almost probably a year postpartum at this point.
Yeah.
But I had rage. I was so angry, and everybody in my life was always like, "Oh, Brandy's the smiley girl. She smiles all the time. She's happy all the time." And then all of a sudden I become this angry person. And so I became a person that just felt awful in my body, and then just the way that I viewed myself at this point. And so I started to one, at this point I was already into my beginning stages of my business. And so I followed a lot of higher level coaches than me at that time. And so I started to understand functional medicine, look at hormones and whatnot. It was very surface level. And so I I believe I was reading Jolene Brighton's like 30 days to get off birth control. I don't know if you know her birth control like protocol, but Jolene Brighton is like one of the most amazing leaders of women's health, and she has been someone that I've like always gone to for like education, reading her books, like taking me through my journey. And so she was the first step in my journey, and I read that book. And so I went through her 30-day protocol, and everything in it I checked off as like my symptoms, and everything pointed to thyroid.
Yeah.
Everything. And I was
Wow.
like,
Okay.
okay, so I got to get my thyroid checked.
Hold on real quick. So leading up to this, were you getting labs done, like just typical labs that probably didn't have full thyroid panels or what?
No.
Okay.
So not up to this point. So one, I didn't have a doctor, like I didn't have a relationship with a PCP or anything like that. I've never really been someone that does go to the doctor. I don't get sick very often. Like I've never had health issues in the past. And so that relationship already was very new,
Yeah.
help from conventional medicine. But once I read her book, I was like, okay, I've got to go get labs done. So I made an appointment with my PCP, went there. Of course, she told me she couldn't do anything. Typical of what we see in the industry nowadays.
Yeah.
And I did fight though. I advocated like hell for the ability to get those tests done. And so she said she would order them, and then said that she basically said, you're probably going to pay out of pocket for these. I was like, I literally don't care, just do them.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And so she did the script. I went into the lab, and then I asked the lab to tell me what she ordered. She didn't order them, right? So
When
I
you
had,
say them, are you talking about like the full thyroid panel, like TPO,
yeah.
ABC?
So yeah, so I wanted TSH, I wanted T4, I wanted T3, I wanted TPO, TGAB, I wanted some other like metabolic testing, I wanted insulin, I wanted some other things, because Jolene Brain actually lists all the labs out that you should get
Yeah.
if you have thyroid symptoms. And that's where every symptom I was having was pointing to. And of course, it said some sex hormones, but I was more concerned about the thyroid because that's what lit up like crazy. I was
Yeah.
like, okay. So I went to get my blood drawn, and that's when I realized that she didn't order them. So I made the lab actually call my doctor back and make sure that she put it on there, and she did. And so if I didn't have advocated for myself, if I didn't push for those labs, regardless of paying for them out of pocket, I would have never gotten my diagnosis. So
Wow.
she got my labs back. She called me, and she basically was like, you have Hashimoto's. So I was like, okay, so what do I do? And
Yeah.
so she prescribed me levothyroxine, of course.
What
And
was your so to have obviously so your TPO was TPOAB was over 34. What was it?
yes, it was about 104 is
Okay.
what I think it was. This was 6 years ago. So I'm trying to remember what those first labs were. But my
Yeah.
TSH was near a 5 too. That was super high. So you could see the stress that was placed on my body. And then I don't remember what my T4 or T3 was, to be quite honest. But the TPO antibodies were high. And so she was like, you have Hashimoto's. And I was like, okay, so what do we do? And the basically she gave me medication, and then she told me to eat selenium nuts, or not
He
selenium
gave
nuts.
you levothyroxine?
Yeah.
That's a T4.
Yeah.
So what was your T3 at the time? Was it
I
tank?
can look it up if you want me to.
No,
Uh,
I just that's interesting because a lot of times people get the levothyroxine, but their T4 will be fine, but their T3 will be low. And so it's not a thyroid issue, it's a conversion issue where levothyroxine really is not like what's essentially needed in that moment.
and they don't look at this kind of stuff either. And so I'm actually curious. I can look at my labs. It would probably take me a minute to get them back. This was again a long time ago. So I'd be interested to see what they were, knowing where I'm at now in coaching, what I know now.
All
But
right. What were your steps forward after that? Obviously, you got the levo, but what about after that?
I honestly, I was very confused at that point, because I was like, okay, I don't know what to do. I know that it's not medication, and I know that there are deeper steps. Like I knew that there were things that I could do that didn't have me relying on medication, that I wasn't necessarily aware of. Like I didn't have that education at that point. And so I did get on levothyroxine for about 6 months, and nothing changed. I was like, okay, I'm done. I'm gonna drop these. During those 6 months, I had not necessarily mentored with Vince Pitstick,
Oh yeah.
but I started following him, and he talked a lot about how to support your thyroid without medication. And
Yeah.
so what he was talking about, I switched on my own. So I made all the steps on my own based on the functional world and the mentors that I was following. I had put my trust in them no matter what, because I just knew that conventional medicine I didn't trust.
Sure.
And so I switched to GTA Forte. So I got on that instead of going on levothyroxine. And
Sure.
not that it made a big difference, but what actually did was starting to reduce my stress. The biggest difference that took away my brain fog, that made me feel like I had more energy was honestly an elimination diet because I ended up with a whole array of GI issues. Like
Yeah.
I would consume anything and I would be full all day long. And then if I ate at dinner, I would be up until 3 a.m. just like walking in circles trying to digest food because that's how much pain was in my stomach. And then I would wake up in the middle of the night thinking that I was having a heart attack because the heartburn was so bad. It was terrible. Like these GI issues, like I'd never experienced before in my life. But then they came full force. And I even went to the doctor for my GI issues. And guess what they told me?
IBS or what?
No, they told me it was because I was smoking marijuana.
Oh, really?
I was like, I died laughing. I was like, I will never see you again.
Yeah,
It
yeah,
was
yeah.
wild to me. Yes, we know that weed can cause long-term issues, especially with cortisol. I don't know if you've done any research on marijuana or THC and your cortisol levels.
Not with cortisol, but it's interesting. I have a book on mitochondria from this doctor, and they're actually coming out with crazy studies that THC and CBD it contains the hormesis effect. So if it's little, it's good. If it's a lot, it's bad. And what they're talking
Yes.
about in regards to autophagy and mitochondria is very low doses is actually inducing autophagy and cleaning out cellular debris, but high doses is actually doing the exact opposite. And so they actually go really deep into this and how it literally is the hormesis effect. Obviously, the way that it's used on the street and being high all day, that's a different story. But like for
Right.
medicinal purposes, using micro doses in order to push that autophagy and everything else. So it's very fascinating the studies that I'm doing with it behind the scenes in regards to this book. But go ahead with your cortisol. I want to hear about that.
Well, it's just like in short amounts. So it's the same thing. I mean, if you take anything that you do to your body that you've never done to, it's going to have that hormesis effect, right? It's just if someone is out of the gym for 4 years and then they go back into it for 3 months and they see great results because it's like they have those newbie gains all over again because they haven't been stimulated in that thing with food when we do diet variation,
Well,
right?
my
If some
thought process, correct me if I'm wrong, Brandy, as far as what you've learned about, my thought process would be, and obviously people that are listening are gonna be like, is Pastor Nick, Dr. Nick really saying this about marijuana? Okay, just from a medicinal standpoint, obviously I live in California. There's dispensaries everywhere. It's as legal as it gets. It's a
yeah,
legitimate prescription out here. But, for very low doses, being that it does have anti-inflammatory properties, being that it does induce autophagy, I would think, especially with its stress relief properties, some people, if they have too much, they get anxiety attacks, which is like
yeah.
the Hormesis principle. But if you do very minimal, my thought process would be on the surface, it would probably help cortisol.
So marijuana actually spikes cortisol initially. Okay. So this is why people do get very anxious. They can't end up falling asleep when they take it for too long. So there are very medicinal properties to THC when you use it in short amount of time. And this is for anything, honestly. But if you use it in 6 week periods, it's very beneficial. If you use it for longer than 6 weeks at a time, then you're going to start to spike your cortisol too high and then we're going to have eventually leading to adrenal fatigue. So when
Yeah,
we
yeah,
have
right.
anxiety, I mean, when you're looking at your high stress clients and your high anxiety clients, well, their cortisol is probably really high. That's why you're seeing that high anxiety with higher doses in marijuana use and or long-term use of marijuana as well. I know for me, when I was back in my 20s, I was like, wow, all this makes sense because at one point I was smoking marijuana every single day
I was
in
too.
my
Oh, yeah.
20s. And then there came a point where I had so much trouble falling and staying asleep. Like I would toss and turn and toss and turn and toss and turn. And I was like, what is going on? I stopped smoking marijuana and everything got so much better.
Wow.
So there's so in my opinion, it's the long-term use, not necessarily the short-term or
Yeah.
yeah. I think that is very medicinal and beneficial to the body, but we don't want to even I would say we wouldn't even want to do small doses long term. You always want to cycle on and off certain things. It's just like when we do nutritional periodization. If you're doing a keto diet, do you want to be in keto for years and years? Hell no.
Yeah, it's just like anything else. Like L-carnitine, you don't want to be on, you don't need to be on it longer than 60 days at a time or anything like that. Just like
Exactly.
with anything, right? So, no, that's really interesting. What I what I want to hear is, so do you technically, by diagnosis, by according to TPOAB, over or under 34, do you have Hashis right now or no?
I say no because I don't have TPO antibodies that high anymore.
Yeah.
So mine are non-existent. I don't believe that you have Hashimoto's forever. I think that
Yeah, no. At the end of the day, by definition, no, of course you don't. It's just like having IBS, right? IBS is literally a state of where your bowels are in that moment. So you could
right.
have IBS after that meal and then in 6 hours no longer have IBS because it's literally irritated bowels. Hey, my bowels today are not irritated. Great. Technically, you don't have IBS. And that was me studying under a gastroenterologist. He and I would discuss this all the time. And he'd be like, yeah, that's technically the definition. Where, so with Hashis is an autoimmune disease. And if TPO would be over 34, and so if your TPO-AB is down and you don't have these antibodies, then yeah, no, you no longer have Hashis.
But here's the thing. So people think that you will always have Hashimoto's because you will never get rid of the gene, right? You will always be able to trigger that gene to go on or off. So when you change your environment, you turn off that gene. But if you live a lived lifestyle, then you're going to trigger that gene to come on again. And then now you're going to trigger antibodies, and now you're going to trigger all your symptoms again. And now your immune system is going to attack your thyroid, right? So it doesn't mean that I can't get hashies again. I'm
Sure.
very susceptible to drawing that immune response back if I choose to live a very high stress lifestyle, if I choose to eat pro-inflammatory foods all the time, maybe I even go through something very traumatic and it's something that I have a really hard time going through, that can trigger my Hashimoto's. But
I actually have, I never knew this, but I for the past couple, we're starting around, I don't know, 2022. That was whenever I was going through my divorce and stress was just crazy through the freaking roof. And I was living out of my car with my dog going back from Houston to Iowa, and it was just nuts. And I started having a little bit of a hypothyroid. I've never had TPOAB ever present on my blood work.
yeah.
And then earlier, actually in 2024, this year, for the first time, my TPOAB was at 11. I actually had present markers, but I was in such a crazy stress state. It was whenever I was going from, I had an apartment in Greece and then I was moving out here. It was like 2 weeks before I moved to California. And but I've never had TPO be higher. Then it will go back to not being present. Like I said, I never had it present up until then. Now, do I have maybe some genetic predispositions to those different things? Yeah, absolutely. But at the end of the day, it's an immune system response, which everybody has. So
Mhm.
anybody can technically have it because, like I said, by definition, it's an immune response. But what's interesting, I just had in my mentoring program, one of the coaches that I'm teaching about Hashis and everything else sent me a lab work of his client. And he said, Nick, look at how high his T3 is. His T3 was like radically through the roof, right? And I go, huh, my first thought was he might have Graves. I go, let's look at some other things first. I didn't have his full blood work. So I asked him, I told him, I go, he has one of two things. I go, this is very interesting because I've known about this. I've just never actually seen it. I go, he either has potential Graves or I go, he has early stage Hashis because early stage Hashis will spike thyroid and then it will tank, but you almost will never, 99% of the time, you'll never catch it that early before it tanks. So
It
that's what,
takes almost a decade for someone to actually be diagnosed with Hashimoto's because
yeah, I was going
it's
to say 8 years
actually
at
what
least.
60% misdiagnosed. So most of the time it's, there's different progressions, of course, but with Hashimoto's, you present with both hyper and hypothyroidism. And
Exactly.
you can switch back and forth.
And this individual ended up having TPOAB on his stuff. And I go, wow. I go, he actually is about to go Hashis. He's spiking right now. And if we don't fix it, it'll eventually drop into hypothyroid, what Hashis is very known for. But it
Yep.
always has, it's called thyrotoxicosis or whatever. The MD in my practice and I were talking about it. He goes, dude, you just caught Hashimoto's before it actually fully went throttle. Like that, that's thyrotoxicosis. But that's
Which
what
is
went on.
crazy because Hashimoto's is hard to catch because you develop most of people who have hypothyroidism have Hashimoto's, but they don't know it because nobody actually tests for the
That's
TPO
really,
antibody. So
yeah.
then you're almost treating it completely wrong because you're not looking at the immune system, you're looking at the thyroid, and now you're just totally healing the wrong place.
Here's the thing that's interesting, and I have sung this song, what I'm about to say, relentlessly to the point to where it's annoying probably for people that follow me, is There is a thyroid specialist that I've studied his literature very freaking deeply. Dr. David Brownstein is he's a thyroid specialist, and he came out with his book, and his book confirmed everything I ever thought. I always told people, I go, listen, there's never been an autoimmune disease on the earth that's ever attacked its own body. It's never happened before. And so when people would say my immune system is attacking me, but I go, it's not possible. It's not true. That's not the way the immune system is designed. I started coming up with certain theories of what was going on. And then this guy in his book literally wrote out what I was theorizing. And what he said was stress and inflammation, and obviously being rooted very heavily in leaky gut, but then other lifestyle things as well, creates such a systemic inflammation that brings about free radicals and oxidative damage. So these free radicals and oxidative damage start attaching to our tissue all over our body. Let's take it in the context of hashis. It starts to cling to the thyroid tissue. So what does your immune system do? Your immune system rises up to attack the